Well, good morning from central Victoria, where I'm speaking from the traditional lands of the Djajawarang peoples. It's good evening here, but good morning for those on the other side of the world. And it's great we can have global dialogue about a global issue. Here, the full moon has just risen over the ranges on a clear, cold night. My name's Brian Walters. I'm a writer and a former barrister, and I'll be chairing this evening's webinar. The Agora Dialogue, founded in Australia but now based in Cyprus, runs programs exploring issues of ethics, justice, sustainability, freedom, knowledge, and power. This evening's presentation will concern the ethics of climate change. In accordance with the word dialogue in the name of our organisation, we'll try some interaction between Julian and me as this webinar progresses, and you can pose questions through the chat function or indeed offer comments, and we encourage you to do that. Here in Australia, we're in the final stages of an election campaign, remarkable for its lack of vision shown by the major parties and their willful blindness to what is happening in the world. Globally, we are in the 6th mass extinction, now competing with asteroid mega catastrophes from deep geologic time. We've moved well beyond the lifestyle at which the planet can support us into the future. And it's never enough. Always the environment has to take second fiddle to the elusive mirage of prosperity. We, who are prosperous beyond the wildest imagination of previous generations, never think we are, or not quite enough. Faced with this global crisis, the planet warming beyond safety, what are the ethical imperatives? Our speaker tonight will be Julian Burnside AO QC. Julian is a Melbourne barrister, well known for his support for human rights and his support for the arts. He has written widely, including several excellent and informative books, most recently Watching Out, Reflections on Justice and Injustice. Now, Julian's CV is long and distinguished and full of heart. Now, to do him justice would use all the time we have, and it may be enough to introduce Julian Burnside as a person recognised in Australia as a national living treasure. Julian, welcome.
Thank you, Brian. That's a very generous introduction. Now, I want to let the audience know that, as you say, this is a dialogue, and atypically, I have invited you to participate whenever you feel inclined to. And what the audience doesn't know is that you know more about climate change than I will probably ever know in my lifetime. So your contributions, wherever you see gaps, will be very welcome. Now, that said, at least at the risk of sounding like a typical barrister, I think it's useful to get some facts on the table before we look to the ethical questions. Now, I think it's important to understand that the idea that the Earth is warmer than it should be because of its distance from the sun was first considered by Fourier in about 1804, if recollection serves. He calculated that the distance between the sun and the Earth was such that our global average temperature should be lower, and he wondered if perhaps there was some reason for this. A little while later, an American scientist called Eunice Foote formed the view and expressed it in a paper which is a very good paper, she expressed the view that carbon-based molecules in the atmosphere prevented the return from the Earth of infrared heat. So the sun sends heat to us, but the greenhouse effect of the environment is such that the Earth warms up. Now, Eunice Foote had two disadvantages. She was a scientist, that's great, but she was female, not good, and she was a feminist. And in her time, that was seriously not good. So basically, her work was forgotten until a few years later when a male scientist, Irish-English scientist called John Tyndall, picked it up, and he wrote about it in 1859. Now, Eunice Foote had written her paper in which she captured the essential points of climate change in 1856. Most people think that the starting point for all of this was in the 20th century. Some people think, for example, that Rachel Carson's A Silent Spring might have been part of it. Well, you've got to go back 100 years before that. Then in the 1890s, 1894, I think, a Swedish scientist, Svante Arrhenius, did some calculations in which he figured out the impact on global average temperature on the one hand, and the percentage of carbon-based molecules in the atmosphere on the other hand. And his figures have never been doubted. So since 1894, we have known about the impact of greenhouse gases. And greenhouse gases are properly so called because they make the Earth into what is in effect a greenhouse, because infrared heat can't escape. The problem is that this produces a risk to the entire world, to the entire population of the world. It is not limited to one country or to one group of people. It threatens all of us. It threatens the human species. We have destroyed many other species in our turn, but it may be that we're going to destroy ourselves, and it will only take a few degrees of temperature increase for that to be the case. Now, different countries have made different contributions to climate change over the last 170 years, on the assumption that the problem began in around about 1850 or thereabouts, which is probably accurate. In any event, the question is, do all of us contribute to preventing the march of climate change, or do just some of us, in particular those who produce the problem? Sorry, my phone just went off. So the question is, who's responsible? Who's responsible for fixing the problem? Those who contributed to it, those who benefited from it, or everyone? That is the core of the ethical problem. The question, the ultimate ethical question is, who's responsible for fixing the problem before it gets out of control? Now, in late 2018, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, issued an interim report in which it said that the world needed to take active steps to thwart climate change by 2030, or it will be too late. And that is one of the most chilling observations I think I've ever heard. So we all will need to be careful. Now, it's quite interesting to see the extent to which different countries have contributed to the problem. There are several ways of ranking the countries of the world. One is by their absolute production of greenhouse gases, and the other is by the production of greenhouse gases per capita. If we just take the per capita rankings, top of the list, surprisingly, is Canada. But Canada has got a population of 38 million people. So even though they churn out a lot of greenhouse gases, they produce a lot per capita. Australia is number 2 on the list in the per capita ranking. Again, because although we have got a small population, we produce very large amounts of greenhouse gases. And I should say greenhouse gases is exactly the right expression, because it makes the world, makes the entire globe operate as if it were a greenhouse. That is to say, it collects heat and accumulates it. The third on the list of emissions per capita is, surprisingly, the United States of America, which has got a big population, although not as big as some, a population of 330 odd million people. It is number 3 on the list of emissions per capita. The 4th on the list of emissions per capita, surprisingly, is Saudi Arabia. Then number 5 is Kazakhstan. Number 6 is Russia. Russia, which produces a lot of greenhouse gases and has only a population of 140 odd million people. So its per capita ranking is quite high. Then if we turn to the ranking by total CO2 emissions, top of the list is China, because although they have a huge population of about 1.4 billion people, 1.4 thousand million people, they produce vast amounts of CO2 emissions. In fact, the amount of CO2 emissions that they produce is approximately 10,720 million tons of CO2 or equivalent per year. It's a vast amount. Second on the list of total emissions is the United States of America. Surprise, surprise. Because although it's got a population of 330 odd million, it produces a very large amount of CO2 or equivalent emissions. I say equivalent because there are some nitrogen-based molecules that also contribute to the greenhouse effect, and methane, of course, is a powerful contributor to it as well. Going down the list, number 3 is India, which produces roughly half the greenhouse gas emissions of the United States, but has a bigger population. Then 4th is Russia, which has got, as I said, a population of something over 140 million people, but produces a large amount of greenhouse gases. It's good to say that Australia's ranking on the total greenhouse gas emissions is 14th, even though our per capita ranking is 2nd. So all of that, I think, raises the question, what are the ethical considerations for dealing with the problem? Do we look at the countries that have benefited from the production of greenhouse gases, like those of us who buy from India or China? Or do we simply look at the per capita ranking so as to see which countries are producing more greenhouse gases per head than others. And by the way, I should add that greenhouse gases are produced not only by burning fossil fuel, but also by clearing forests which absorb vast amounts of carbon-based molecules. And this is an area on which Brian is very knowledgeable. So the question is, do we consider that this is an obligation of every country in the world, or do we say, well, if the human species goes extinct, we can blame other countries for it? That is to say, if we were around, we could blame other countries for it. It seems to me that the fact is that we are facing a major crisis, a crisis which seems to be ignored by many countries, including, as Brian pointed out in his introduction, both major parties in Australia, because although we have an election at the end of this week, the fact remains that neither of the major parties has got a coherent plan for abolishing climate change by 2030. And the present government, the Liberal Party, say that they propose to get to net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, which is the absolute latest that is possible. But for the last 30% of that change, they don't know what the method will be. So it's just, hoping that they can do something. The consequences of climate change are things like rising sea levels, shrinking of mountain glaciers, and shifts in the blooming times of flowers and plants. Leave aside the actual temperature and the impact on the ocean. The fact is that human activity is the major source of greenhouse gas emissions and therefore of climate change. The IPCC was formed in 1988 and so far seems to have been ignored by many countries, which is terrible. It is interesting to reflect on the fact that current warming is happening at about 10 times the rate of any post-ice age warming. Okay, so go back to the last ice age, and we are warming the Earth at 10 times the rate that the Earth warmed since then. It's breathtaking. The cost of taking no action against it, the ultimate cost is the extinction of our species. The financial cost between now and then is about $44 trillion by 2060. So think about that. 44 million dollars. And the losses are going to be spread right across the globe. How do you measure the loss of our species, which has, in so many other ways, dominated the Earth for so long? Now, it seems to me that looking at those who've contributed to it is one way of resolving the ethical problem. The difficulty with that is that since the Industrial Revolution began, we have all contributed to climate change in different ways and with different benefits. One of the great contributors to climate change, surprisingly, was the United Kingdom. Of course, the United Kingdom became very rich by the way it exploited India in particular. But the United Kingdom has taken very serious steps in recent times to address the problem of climate change. It seems to me that the most effective way of addressing climate change is to say it's a job for all of us, according to our abilities. And in particular, what should happen, what can happen, is that Australia, which contributes to climate change in various ways, not least by digging up mountains of coal and oil and gas and sending those to other countries where they produce greenhouse gases. The first thing that Australia should do, in my opinion, is to stop producing fossil fuels for other countries in the world to use, because the consequence of other countries in the world using them is the ultimate extinction of the human species. Maybe the same can be said for Russia, because the gas and oil which it exports is, I think, largely sent to other countries, and it produces in those other countries vast amounts of greenhouse gases. I don't know offhand whether the figures for Russia include its contribution by what it produces, but I do know that Australia's contribution to greenhouse gases is, to a very large extent, produced locally. And what we need to do is stop making it easier for other countries to produce greenhouse gases, because that's what we're doing. If we say, well, we're not going to hunt for more fossil fuels, instead we're going to redeploy those same human beings to building and installing solar panels, lithium batteries, or other methods to allay the problem, then we will be making great steps towards saving the species. Even in Australia's case, that contribution would exceed the extent to which we have produced the problem or profited from the problem being produced. But from here on, if Australia sells fossil fuels to other countries, we are not only helping produce the problem, we are profiting from it as well. And that, I think, is a powerful ethical argument for holding off.
Julian, can I just offer an observation and a question, really? The observation is that Australia is the world's third biggest exporter of fossil fuels by CO2 potential. So we're a big player, but we often hear, at least in the Australian political discourse, people saying, well, it doesn't really matter what we do because China, US, Russia, name whichever countries that happen to be favourable to name at the time, produce so much that we can't make any difference. What are the ethics of that kind of approach to this problem?
I think the ethics have to be driven by the fact that the bottom line of all of this is that we will simply go extinct as a species. Now, how do we avoid that? We do whatever we can. And if we are contributing to the problem by digging up fossil fuels and selling them, then I think we should stop. That seems to me to be a reasonable ethical response. That said, I think it's interesting that in total emissions, Australia is ranked 14th. Anyway, I think It's very difficult to think of any equivalent ethical problems, because when you're faced with the extinction of the entire species, how do you figure that out? I think that we owe it to the world to do whatever we can. And one thing we can do is reduce the number of fossil fuels that we dig up and export, because digging them up and exporting them helps other countries contribute to the problem, which may ultimately result in our demise. When you get right down the list to the countries that produce very little, Canada, for example, what do we do about Canada? Canada has got a population only a bit bigger than Australia's. It's a population of about 38 million. It is 7th in the world in the number of the total amount of emissions, and yet it's top of the list in emissions per capita. So what do we do about Canada? I would say that people in Canada should contribute as much as they can to reducing the problem as best they can. China is a major difficulty. In fact, China sort of makes the ethical point. China is by far the biggest producer of CO2 emissions, 10,720 million tonnes per annum. Compare that with America, which is just over 5,000 million tonnes per annum. So China is double the production of CO2 emissions than America. But China has a population of 1.4 billion people. America has a population of about 333 million people. So a tiny fraction of what China has. And on the emissions per capita, China is way down the list. It's, I think, 14th, equal with South Africa, interestingly. But I suppose if you made it impossible or unlawful for China to keep producing greenhouse gases, that would help resolve the problem to some extent. But on the other hand, it means that millions of Chinese people would suffer very badly. I haven't researched far enough to see what would happen to Chinese individuals if they stopped using fossil fuels to the extent that they would have to suffer that they would experience the sort of reduction that we're looking for. But if they did, then I guess it would help resolve the problem. It would resolve it to a large extent. Mind you, China has got a remarkable number of solar and wind-powered generators, far more than Australia has got. So just look at the raw amount of CO2 emissions produced by China. May be misleading. But I think the ultimate ethical answer is we'll have to do what we can, because if we don't, then we will go extinct. And that may be unpalatable, but the fact remains that going extinct is equally unpalatable. A fact which we have not noticed when we've driven other animals to their extinction, in large measure by our production of fossil fuels. But having said all that, I think that is the ethical solution. Just do what you can to stay alive. That's what we all need to do. We need to do what we can to stay alive. And if us staying alive brings with it the fact that other people stay alive, well, that's the way it is. And I don't think that would be such a terrible thing. But I think that is what I'd like to say in relation to the ethics of climate change. And I don't think I've got anything useful that I can add in addition to that.
I wanted to talk about the impact of climate change. You mentioned a few things about the way it is unfair, and I thought a few examples of that might be given. Think about Bangladesh. It's a poor country. In the summer of 2006, the Bay of Bengal was unusually rough, and usually there's only 1 or 2 weather warnings a year for fishermen, but that year there were 4 warnings in just 2 months. And each warning costs poor fishermen from Bangladesh several valuable days in lost production. So that's the existential situation they're in. And when the 4th warning came in 2006, most fishermen couldn't afford the loss and went to sea anyway. And the official death toll from the storm that followed is 1,700, but many believe the real figure is 10,000. And that was just one incident. But still in Bangladesh, the Sundarbans Wetland Nature Reserve, it's one of the wildest places on earth. And it's that delta where major rivers run into the Bay of Bengal. And it's the home of the world's largest wild tiger population. And the water is becoming increasingly saline. And people are being progressively flooded out of that area as the water becomes saline, and in fact the sea level is noticeably rising. Now, Bangladesh has done almost nothing to contribute to the problems of climate change, but they're experiencing it quite directly. And still in that part of the world, the Himalayas, if you're a villager in the Himalayas, you live with the constant fear that you'll experience what so many villagers in the Himalayas have now experienced in the last few decades. The glaciers are melting, and when they melt, they form large moraine lakes, and they're held in place by unstable walls of rock and mud until what happens is one night the rocky moraine collapses and the villages below are swept away in a massive tide of water and rock, and many have died in the Himalayas from this. And again, these people have done almost nothing to contribute to climate change, but they're living with the daily effect in their lives now. Or if you're a Pacific Islander, you're experiencing extreme high tides, which damage homes, inundate crops and erode coastlines. The water supply is becoming increasingly saline. You're seeing erosion of beaches and areas that you've previously known. Again, you've done almost nothing to contribute to global warming, but you're already experiencing it. And that's happening now. And indeed, in Australia, the Torres Strait Islanders are taking action in the UN against the Australian government on this. So the burden is not shared equally. And it doesn't seem to fall on those who've caused it. And although in the end, I think we're all in this boat together and we will all suffer. But the UN Human Rights Council has said that the adverse effects of climate change will be felt most acutely by the segments of the population who are already in a vulnerable situation. And that makes sense. And again, surely that drives the ethical imperative, and it means that we are in a world that can't be insular anymore. There are no islands. There's no shielding ourselves from this problem.
I understand.
Yeah.
It captures the ethical problem very directly. mean, the people in the Himalayas are, and there's no doubt that the impact on the Himalayas is a direct result of the world's average temperature increasing. The people on who it has an impact can do nothing about it. Nothing they do will make any difference unless they just disappear and become refugees in another country. Although that's a whole different subject. Should the rest of the world take steps? Of course, the rest of the world should take steps to try and reduce that impact. But does the rest of the world know? Does the rest of the world care? The fact is that the ethical problem, it lies mainly in the fact that it is going to impact all of us. And it's a unique problem in that regard. It's the only problem which has faced the entire human species as a species. My best guess is that the right ethical solution is one which would fall first on those whose contribution to the problem is the greatest, second on those whose benefits from the problem is the greatest, and third, it really falls on all of us, because all of us will stand to lose the same amount. The irony of all this is that in Australia, which has been inhabited by Aboriginal people for 50 or 60,000 years, until white people turned up, 250 years ago or a bit less. The irony of that is that the impact of global warming may mean that the Aboriginal people get their land back, at least temporarily, or at least that they will be able to cope with the consequences of global warming for a bit longer than most of us. Now, what that says about the ethics of the problem, I'm not sure. But
Julian, one other issue about the ethics, which I thought I'd ask you about, is the fact that those who will, people are suffering now, but those who will suffer most will in many cases be future generations, people who currently have no voice.
Yep.
They can't take legal proceedings, they can't do anything because as yet they're not with us. But they're going to suffer from actions taken today. Now, most ethical problems deal with immediate interactions between people and groups of people, but this is on a different level because we don't have a ready framework for giving a voice or rights to those who aren't here.
I agree, that's part of the problem. But oddly, the problem is being dealt with in a practical way by some people, because a lot of young people that I've been speaking to recently have said that they do not intend to have children. In other words, they don't want any children that they have or grandchildren they have to inherit a world which is worse than the world which they themselves inherited. Mind you, that degree of selflessness is unusual and probably doesn't withstand the compulsion of sexuality.
Yeah, and it also highlights the problem of the lack of hope that we're leaving young people at the moment, that they don't feel that the world's got a future that they can be part of in that way.
That is certainly part of the problem. And that's why I suspect that when push comes to shove, everyone will do what they can to avoid the inevitable. The real question is whether they can be persuaded to do that sooner rather than later. And maybe, when I started thinking about this problem, I thought initially that the people who contributed the most to the problem or benefited the most from the problem should probably take the greatest steps. But I've shifted. I think it's now ultimately a question for all of us. We all have to do what we can to reduce the problem, because all of us face the possibility of extinction.
There's a specific issue in relation to leaders, but particularly political leaders in relation to this, and that is that at the moment, no one really has the luxury of ignorance about this problem. And in facing this crisis, if those in power fail to properly inform themselves about the science, or fail to act on the science, or, as we are seeing, still worse, deny the science, isn't that an ethical issue? They're failing the community and their moral obligations to the community by those failures.
That is an ethical problem. And I would say that the Liberal National Party in Australia is illustrating that perfectly, because they do not have a coherent approach to all of this. There are members of that party or that coalition which simply denies the science, even though the science goes back 170 years. They deny it. It's breathtaking. Our Prime Minister was a man who took a lump of coal into the Parliament in order to demonstrate that it was not something to be afraid of. It's how he got away with that is hard to imagine. And yet, the fact is that during this election, it has been almost impossible for anyone to speak about climate change in a way that didn't get scorn tipped on it. And I suspect that it's because people like our Prime Minister reckon that he'll be well and truly gone before climate change really hits. What he overlooked was that in late 2019, early 2020, we had terrible bushfires in Australia, followed by terrible floods in the northeast of Australia. Now, if that wasn't a warning about climate change, then I don't know what he needs to be shown.
And we seem to be measuring our well-being as a community by mere financial calculations, rather than looking at the broader well-being of the community, and particularly the future well-being of our ecosystem. It's a whole mindset that has about it all the power of conventional wisdom, and yet it's serving us so poorly in the face of this crisis.
That is true, but the problem remains, how do you persuade people that they should sacrifice something now in order to avoid a consequence for future generations? How do you persuade people that even though they have got almost nothing to gain by their current sacrifice, yet what they do will help the species survive? Maybe. That's the ethical problem. How do you persuade people of that?
Well, is a democratic political system capable of dealing with this problem?
If you look at the United States of America, the answer has got to be no. And what the Republican Party is doing over there is beyond belief.
And how do we fix it?
Well, maybe we have to go extinct so that some other species will emerge, which is
I'm not
better.
quite ready for that. I was hoping there might be a better alternative.
Yes, I was rather hoping that too.
I mean, I'm not advocating tyranny or anything of that nature, but I'm trying to work out. Here we are confronted with a case study in politics at the moment where it's just not working. We are not seeing powerful parties in this search for obtaining democratic majorities dealing with what is manifestly the most important issue confronting their electorate. I mean, it's not as though they say nothing about it, but they just don't say enough, and that's very alarming.
It is, and I think that part of the problem is that politicians are concerned about the immediate future, whereas we really need to be concerned about the long-term future. We need to be concerned about what happens to our grandchildren and great-grandchildren rather than what happens to us. That's the difficulty.
So should there be, for example, a way of assessing legislation or political decisions which factors in the impact on the environment, as there is, that we have committees that scrutinise the acts and regulations of government on various criteria. Should this be another?
Yes, it should. The problem is that it will draw hatred and contempt from the usual suspects. And the fact remains that there are vast amounts of money involved in the fossil fuel industry in this country, and perhaps also in Russia. And those interests, which are essentially local, will inevitably come out and oppose anything which is said by anyone which might have an impact on the money they make.
Well, one of the issues that comes to mind in relation to that is whether, in terms of ethics, it's ethical for politicians, for example, to receive donations from fossil fuel interests, and they have received big donations. I mean, it's on the public record that Matt Canavan, the senator from Queensland, who's so loud in relation to these issues in favour of the fossil fuel industry, has received large donations from that quarter. Now, there's a mantra that, of course, donations don't affect the way people advocate in Parliament, but the reverse seems manifestly to be the case.
Yes, I agree. And in my opinion, the fossil fuel industry should not be allowed to make huge donations to parties or to members of Parliament, because the fact is that whenever the party or the member of Parliament has to make a decision, they make a decision which is inclined in favour of fossil fuel. And that's a real problem. I mean, it's not difficult to think of other examples that are equally problematic, but I think that getting rid of donations like that would be a good start. Mind you, we're talking largely about the Australian position, because Australia is a very old country and fossil fuels we have in abundance.
Fortunately, we've also got sunshine and wind.
Well, it's interesting. I started by referring to Fourier in 1804, but arguably the resolution of all this goes back even further to Isaac Newton in the 17th century, because he came up with the theory of the conservation of energy. And the conservation of energy is right at the heart of all of this, because if infrared heat can't escape, then the energy which is found in abundance in existing forests survives when those forests fall down or the trees die and become eventually coal or oil or gas. You know, vast amounts of energy, all of them sunshine from millions of years ago. So we have accumulated the amount of sunshine that we receive, and Fourier wondered why our temperature is what it is. Well, maybe we should be aware of the fact that the accumulation of millions of years of sunshine coupled with what is happening now is a real problem. You know, it's just if the heat can't escape, then the fact is that the temperature of the Earth will increase, and it is increasing. Mind you, I don't think Isaac Newton ever went that far in his thinking.
Well, speaking of scientists, you were kind enough to say that I knew something about the contribution of native forest logging to climate change, and there have been recent studies by the Australian National University on this, and the results have been quite spectacular. The hardwood forests of southeastern Australia, and I can't speak for other countries with as much authority, but here they store massive amounts of carbon, and the logging of those forests releases long-term 2,000 tonnes of carbon. That's not carbon dioxide, that's just carbon, which becomes carbon dioxide into
when it's burned,
when it's disposed of. And it is nearly all. They've done life studies of what happens, and the long-term, it's really a long-term in this is about 5 to 10 years. Net loss is about 2,000 tonnes per hectare. Now that's huge. By the way, you don't get that loss with plantations because it's a net balancing out. But with native forests being destroyed and then the spindly regrowth, the net loss is huge. It's more than, for example, all the carbon pollution from the cars in Melbourne here in Victoria. And so this is low-hanging fruit. It's publicly owned forest. There's no profit gained by the government from doing it. It's subsidised, the logging. We could just stop that, save ourselves some money, and make a big impact on our carbon footprint.
I agree. And I think one way of doing it might be for the major political parties in this country and other countries to say, look, we face a catastrophe. It's really clear what we have to do to avoid it, and here's how we go about it. Now, in this country, especially in Queensland, people are worried about the jobs that will be lost when, or rather if, the coal mines are closed down. But the simple fact is that there are lots of other jobs to be made by, for example, getting people into creating solar panels, getting people into creating wind turbines, getting people involved in making batteries and other forms of energy storage, because we do need energy at night, even if the wind isn't blowing. So I just don't think that the impact on jobs would be as catastrophic as people say.
Well, indeed, the fact is that the mining industry in Australia employs very few people. It's to give one comparison, there is a single welfare organisation called Anglicare. It employs more people than all of the mining industry in Australia.
And you can add to that the attempt seems to be in all business to reduce the number of people who are employed in exchange for substituting machines or the like, because they're a lot cheaper.
Yeah.
So what do we do? How much are we prepared to give up to ensure the survival of our species? That's the ultimate ethical question. It seems we should do what we can.
There are ways ahead, but at the moment we're not seeing that nettle grasped with, at least in our part of the world. There are other countries which are doing, I think, a better job of it, but we're not seeing that here. Now, on that note, we're coming up to time. Is there any final observation you wanted to make, Julian?
Just that we should do everything we can to avoid the ultimate demise of our species. And that will include leaning on politicians of all colours in all jurisdictions, trying to get them to make it essential. Because ultimately, the politicians who drive various countries will be the ones who are held up in scorn and hatred by some later species that takes our place. And they would deserve it, because they've had 170 years to see what's going on.
Well, Julian, I want to thank you for the contribution you've made this evening, for your experience and wisdom and thoughtfulness in putting this together, and in particular that overview of the scientific awareness that's been there now for so long, and of the place that various countries take in the hierarchy of good and evil on this topic. Thanks very much, Julian, and thanks to our audience.
Thanks, Brian, and thank you very much for your contribution too, because your knowledge in this area is formidable.